Ye old Wikipedia. Has Wikipedia been around the whole time you've been alive? Kind of interesting. I apologize, I'm old. So, a lot of this is still feeling new to me, that we have this kind of online encyclopedia that people can literally update daily, even though they get in arguments over it sometimes. So he's Scottish, 1711. 1776 is such a neat year to die, I suppose, because of all the things that made that an important year to remember. So it's kind of like one of those philosophical anchors, if you have kind of like a time map in your head. 1776, David Hume dies then, and you could, and Kant reads him slightly at about the same time, but you just use that as kind of a focal date. But he's going to complete the British empiricist triad, essentially. Remember, we oddly think of John Locke as the beginning of the British empiricist because of his recognition that there are characteristics that we see, hear, taste, etc., that he calls secondary qualities. And the primary qualities he assumes or hypothesizes must be out there, otherwise we couldn't be interacting with them and have those sensations, etc. So the primary qualities of things. The second individual in this triad is Berkeley. Berkeley comes along to fight Locke because of the materialist possibilities that that's going to lead to, especially with regard to belief in God. And so he argues that everything is really in the mind of God. Everything is spirit. Now, when you read the usual expression of what Berkeley is saying, it sounds like, what the heck is he talking about? My interpretation that he and Leibniz are both talking about energy in an arrangement, and that he's calling that the mind of God. That's very different than the typical way Berkeley is understood. Not necessarily Leibniz, but at least with Berkeley. And so Berkeley usually comes across as a wacko, ridiculous idea that's quickly put to bed by David Hume, because David Hume comes in and follows up by pointing out, what on earth is he talking about is the mind of God, and what's your grounds for that? Right? So David Hume's philosophy picks up on the idea that all of our knowledge comes from the impressions that we get from our experiences. And even the ideas that we have in our head, he feels, come from impressions that we've had. So if for example, we have the idea of a golden island, well, we've seen gold and we've seen islands, and as a result we can put these two things together even though we haven't seen a golden island. So the idea of us having imagination and putting different concepts together as a result of impressions of individual things, right, leads us to concoct all kinds of relationships that, for example, give us the ideas of God, for example, where we have a concept of God that is all powerful. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, we've seen powerful individuals, maybe even powerful things like a landslide. Don't be in the way of a landslide, or even what's it called when you're in a snowy environment and the snow falls down? What's that called? Avalanche, thank you. Why do we call that different than a landslide? Well, because it isn't land, it's snow. Avalanche. I wonder where that comes from. Sounds foreign. French, maybe. Avalanche? I don't know. So I mean, that's powerful. You experience something that's powerful, more powerful than you, perhaps, more powerful than anyone knows how to stop it, and so on. So we have a concept of powerfulness. What else do you put together to get a sense that there's some creature that's powerful enough that literally can create the universe? But you haven't actually experienced that. And so what you're clearly doing is putting together concepts based on impressions that give you something that's imaginary, and you have no proof for it. So basically, David Hume asks, what God? And in his dialogues on natural religion, David Hume will actually give us arguments against the typical arguments that you get for the concept of God. For example, the cause and effect. There's things happening, and there's then things that happen because of that, etc., etc. And what was the first cause? Well, that has to be God. David Hume says, prove it. No one's been there. It's not like someone saw the first event, or you see the prime mover. So in a way, what his real criticism is on those people that believe things that can't actually be proven. So it's a criticism, really, of what Bertrand Russell says that he's really criticizing the inductive method. So what is the inductive method? We've talked about the deductive method, and the idea is that you know certain things, and knowing those things leads you directly to knowing further things. But in each step of a deductive argument, the information that you're coming to conclude is already in the premises, so you're not actually learning anything new. You're just revisiting knowledge you already have and seeing what further follows from that. That's a deductive argument. But inductive reasoning, you start off by seeing something, and you think, wow, that's curious. And you see it again, and you think, wow, that's interesting. And you see it again, and for Aristotle, if you see it 4 times, well, that proves it. As far as Aristotle was concerned, it only took 4 times, and you can assume that the cause and the effect are necessarily related. But David Hume looks at this and says, well, where do I get the sense of necessity from this relationship? Well, let's see. I drop a ball and it bounces. I have to come up with an explanation of why that ball bounced, and so I have, something to do about the nature of the material so that it has, this kind of reaction, expanding and the force, absorbed and then expands again, or gravity, whatever. I bounce the ball, and after a few times, I feel like, gee, it's clearly cause and effect. I drop the ball, it bounces, etc. Well, can you imagine that not happening? Yes. You can imagine dropping the ball and it just sits on the floor. Maybe try this one. If I'm playing pool, this is actually an example he uses, right? I'm shooting, at the cue ball, aiming at the ball that I want to sink in the pocket or whatever, right? The 8 ball, whatever. And as I shoot, since I'm lined up perfectly and the table is stable, I hit the ball just right and it goes right in the pocket. Cause and effect, right? I could even set it up exactly so I do it again, do it multiple times, and I'm absolutely convinced, what convinces me of this is my memory of the previous events. So I'm trusting to my memory that gives me a knowledge of what's going to happen, and I say that this is a necessary cause and effect. Well, the issue is, if I can imagine the cue ball heading towards the 8 ball, and just before the 8 ball gets hit, the 8 ball jumps up in the air, laughs at the cue ball and says, "Ha ha, you can't get me." And the cue ball goes underneath it and it says, "Hey, you can't do that." Sinks into the pocket, a scratch, right? What? Wait a minute, that doesn't happen. It can't happen, but I can imagine it. I just did, right? And especially think of that as having watched the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit. If anybody ever remembers that one? I've popped out of reality into a tune. All of a sudden I was in a cartoon, and no, wait a minute, that can't really happen. But you can imagine it. And the thing is, if you can imagine it, then it's not logically contradictory. Because David Hume argues, I can't hold a contradiction in my mind. I can't see it and not see it at the same time. So basically, it's not a logical contradiction that everything happens the way I remember it. And if that's not a logical necessity, then what kind of necessity is it? Well, his answer is, as a matter of fact, necessity. So as a matter of fact, in my memory, I see this happening all the time. I'm assuming that this is cause and effect. Well, guess what? That's not proof. Not in the sense of a mathematical kind of proof. It's a hypothesis. It's a guess based on my previous experiences. And that being a guess means that it isn't proof, not in the kind of mathematical sense that a lot of philosophers think that they're really giving for all these kinds of things. Descartes, for example, is another example. I think, therefore I am. We all like that. Lots of folks, resorted to that when I asked, what kind of knowledge, modern philosopher, gives you a sense of how you know something for sure. And lots of us feel real comfortable, with, well, you can't deny that you exist. Actually goes all the way back to Augustine, right? But here's the problem for David Hume. Descartes concludes that there is a res cogitans, a thinking thing that he's proved exists because of this argument. Well, what David Hume points out is whenever I try to get an image or a sense of myself apart from the experiences that myself is having at the moment, I can never find it. There's nothing there. Right? You know that you're having an experience. You smell the pizza, you taste the pizza, you enjoy the pizza, you pay for the pizza, all that stuff associated with the pizza. But where is the you that's enjoying all of this stuff? You don't actually see that. Do you? You don't see your soul. In fact, we're going to eventually get to the point where, that's one of the main characteristics of the self is that you can't see the self, the subjective side of the self that's having the experience, because it's busy having the experience, so it can't see itself. David Hume doesn't say that, but nonetheless, you're essentially in that situation. You can't see the self that's having the experience. So we basically end up with no experience that gives us a concept of a physical self that's persistent over time. In fact, today we have lots of folks that take that point of view. I think I mentioned the book Being No One by Thomas Metzinger. How do you get used to the idea that you're actually no one? Well, you don't have a persistent self that's consistent over time. you're instead constantly changing, right? That seems nonsense. Obviously, there's a self that's changing, but the point he's trying to make is that since you change so consistently, it's hard to identify exactly what a persistent self might be. It's kind of like the old, idea of the river. You can't step into the same river twice because the river has changed since the last time you stepped into it. In fact, you wouldn't even have the same foot